The transition from ghost in the corner to consort of the Empire was not a move toward comfort, but a descent into a new, more gilded kind of warfare. While the three claiming marks on Gino's neck served as a warning to the outside world, within the private penthouse of the Kang brothers, they were a constant, physical tether to three men who had spent their lives sharing everything and were now learning how to share a soul. Gino still woke at 5:00 a.m., his internal clock as precise as a Swiss movement, but now he woke not to the silence of a lonely apartment, but to the rhythmic breathing of a fortress. He would lie still for exactly 3 minutes, cataloging the weight of Junho's arm across his waist, the heat of Junsu's back against his own, and the way Youngwon, even in sleep, tended to curl his fingers around Gino's wrist as if checking a pulse. The board members at the Kang Empire still didn't understand that the Omega who sat in the high-backed chair behind the triplets wasn't there for decoration. They didn't see the way Gino's amber eyes flicked to the slight twitch in a rival's eyelid, or the way he would slide a single, handwritten note across the mahogany table that could dismantle a hostile takeover before the first sentence was finished. He remained a man of silence, but that silence had grown teeth. He no longer just resolved seating arrangements or coffee preferences. He managed the shadows that the kings were too prominent to touch, using his photographic memory to map the secret debts and hidden shames of every person who dared to look at his alphas with anything less than total subservience. Yet the true depth of the story began on a Tuesday, when a package arrived at the headquarters addressed not to the kings, but to the voice of the ghost, containing nothing but a dried flower from the island that should have been a graveyard and a single coordinates line that pointed to the only place on Earth the Kang family hadn't yet conquered. Gino didn't show the note to the brothers immediately. Instead, he sat in the war room alone, his pen hovering over his notepad, writing a single sentence over and over until the ink bled through the paper. They think you are the weakness, but you are the trap. He knew that the peace they had built was a thin veneer over a brewing storm, and as he watched the sunset turn the Seoul skyline the color of a fresh bruise, Gino realized that being theirs meant more than just being loved. It meant becoming the shield for three men who had forgotten how to bleed because he was always there to catch the blade first. The arrival of the coordinate line was the first crack in the absolute control Gino had maintained since the island, a reminder that while the three kings ruled the visible world, there were ghosts in the periphery who still viewed an Omega as a bargaining chip rather than a sovereign. Gino spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused clinical analysis, his mind a whirlwind of data points and risk assessments that he kept meticulously hidden behind his usual mask of calm efficiency. When Junho entered the private study at 2:00 a.m. and found Gino surrounded by holographic architectural blueprints of an abandoned shipyard in Bucen, the air in the room thickened with the protective, territorial scent of an alpha who could sense a threat before it was spoken. Gino didn't flinch. He simply tapped the screen, highlighting a thermal signature that shouldn't have been there. A ghost signal repeating the same 333 pattern he had used to call them to the island, a mockery of his own distress signal. The brothers gathered around him, Junsu standing like a wall of granite behind Gino's chair, and Youngwon leaning over the desk with a smile that was no longer politely amusing, but razor-edged and predatory. They realized simultaneously that the kidnapping hadn't been an isolated act of greed by Park Do-yeon, but a test run for a larger syndicate that specialized in breaking high-value Omegas to destabilize the alphas who relied on them. Gino watched their faces, his amber eyes moving with the precision of a master tactician, and instead of signing for comfort, he pulled out his notepad and wrote, "They are expecting you to be the sword. I need you to be the bait." It was a staggering role reversal that challenged the very core of their alpha instincts, the idea of using themselves as a distraction, while their protected mate operated the heavy machinery of their destruction. But Gino wasn't asking, he was directing. He spent the night reprogramming the Kang Empire's internal security mainframe, his fingers flying at 140 words per minute, weaving a digital trap that would turn the shipyard into a literal cage for anyone who stepped inside. He was no longer the assistant who prepared the coffee. He was the architect of a counterstrike so silent and so absolute that it wouldn't just save them. It would erase the very memory of their enemies. As the sun began to rise, Gino reached out and touched the claiming marks on his neck, then pointed at the brothers and then at himself, signing a final, chilling vow. "You gave me your names, I will give you their silence." The fog rolling off the East Sea into the Bucen shipyard was thick enough to swallow sound, creating a sensory vacuum that Gino navigated with the chilling ease of a predator born to the dark. Following his design, the three kings moved through the rusted skeletal remains of the docks with deliberate, visible arrogance, projecting the image of alphas blinded by rage and desperation, while Gino existed as a shadow within shadows, perched 30 feet above them on a crane gantry. From his vantage point, he monitored the feed on a wrist-mounted tactical display, his eyes darting between thermal heat signatures and the movements of his three mates. He saw the trap before the enemies even realized they were the ones being hunted. When the Syndicate's mercenaries emerged from the darkness, thinking they had cornered the most powerful men in East Asia, they didn't find three panicked alphas, but a synchronized killing machine that moved with a terrifying rhythmic grace. Yet the true strike came from the silence above. Gino didn't use a gun, but the shipyard's own automated systems, which he had slaved to his folio's localized network. With a single tap of a touchscreen, he triggered a sequence of industrial magnetic locks and heavy cargo containers that shifted with a deafening groan of metal, isolating the Syndicate leader in a steel box, while the brothers systematically dismantled the perimeter guard. In the center of the chaos, Junho looked up, his gray eyes catching the faint reflection of Gino's amber gaze from the rafters. And for a split second, the hierarchy of the protected Omega was shattered. Junho didn't see a victim to be rescued, but a god of the machine who was presiding over the battlefield. Gino signaled them in Morse code using a high-intensity flashlight, a rapid strobe that translated to, "The leader is yours, the infrastructure is mine." By the time the brothers reached the trapped man, Gino had already wiped the Syndicate's offshore accounts and redirected their communication protocols to a dead-end server in the Arctic, effectively lobotomizing the organization's global reach in less than 6 minutes. He descended the gantry with the stillness of a ghost, walking into the center of the bloody aftermath where the three kings stood breathing heavily, their black suits dusted with salt and iron. He didn't write a note this time. He simply walked to Junho, Junsu, and Yungwen, taking each of their hands in turn and pressing them to the claiming marks on his throat, which were pulsing with the heat of his adrenaline. The message was clear without a single word or pen stroke. They were the kings of the empire, but he was the soul of the war, and the world was finally beginning to understand that the most dangerous place to stand was between a silent man and his throne. The aftermath of the Bucen gambit left the Kang Empire in a state of clinical, terrifying efficiency, but the victory brought with it a realization that Gino's safety was no longer a private matter. It was a geopolitical variable. Back in the sanctuary of the Soul Penthouse, the atmosphere shifted from the adrenaline of combat to a suffocating, possessive domesticity, as the three kings retreated into a primal state of hypervigilance that threatened to turn Gino's home into a gilded cage. Junho stopped attending public galas unless Gino was physically tethered to his side. Junsu began personalizing the security encryption on Gino's devices every 3 hours, and Yungwen, usually the most light-hearted, spent his nights staring at the bedroom door with a predatory focus that made even the air feel heavy. Gino watched this descent into obsession with a quiet, calculating sorrow, knowing that if he didn't break the cycle of their fear, the very men he loved would become the walls that stifled his brilliance. One evening, he sat them down in the center of the floor, the same way they had sat in the concrete cell, and instead of a notepad, he used the sign language he had once kept hidden, his hands moving through the air with the sharp, rhythmic beauty of a conductor. "I am not a porcelain doll you found on an island. I am the architect who built the road you walk on," he signed, his amber eyes flashing with a rare, burning defiance that made the three alphas recoil as if struck. He made them look at the scars on his hands from the gantry and the bruise on his neck that was finally fatting, forcing them to acknowledge that his value didn't lie in his fragility, but in his resilience. To prove his point, he pulled up a hidden file on the central monitor, revealing that while they had been busy hovering over him, he had quietly acquired a 15% stake in their primary competitor's holding company using the Syndicate's liquidated assets, effectively ending a 20-year trade war without firing a single shot. The triplets stood in stunned silence, realizing that while they were trying to protect a ghost, Gino had been busy expanding their kingdom into a territory they hadn't even considered. It was Yungwen who moved first, dropping to his knees and resting his forehead against Gino's thigh in a gesture of absolute surrender, followed by Junsu and Junho, who finally let the tension bleed out of their shoulders. Gino ran his fingers through their hair, a king among kings, understanding that true power wasn't about being untouchable. It was about being so indispensable that even your silences were treated as law. The equilibrium they had fought to establish was shattered when a ghost from Gino's pre-Empire life, The biological father who had sold him into service at 18 because a mute child was broken currency, reappeared as a puppet for a desperate coalition of rival board members. This man, a shadow of alcoholism and failed gambles, didn't understand that the boy he had discarded had become the soul of a dynasty. He walked into the Kang Empire lobby demanding compensation for his son, unaware that he was walking into a den of wolves who had spent months perfecting the art of controlled violence. Gino watched the security feed from the inner sanctum, his face a mask of frozen marble as he observed the man's crude gestures and the way he spoke Gino's name like it was a piece of cheap property. The three kings didn't even let the man reach the elevator. They met him in the lobby, a wall of navy wool and cold gray eyes that sucked the oxygen out of the room. But it was Gino who stepped out of the shadows last, his presence more commanding than any shout. Instead of the cowering child his father expected, he saw a man draped in the authority of the Kang name, his neck marked by three kings and his eyes devoid of the fear that had defined his youth. Gino didn't allow the brothers to strike. Instead, he opened his leather folio and handed the man a single sheet of paper, not a check, but a comprehensive list of every debt, every crime, and every person the man had ever betrayed, compiled with the terrifying precision of Gino's photographic memory. He signed with a slow, devastating finality that Yongwan translated aloud for the silent lobby. "You didn't sell a son, you sold your only mercy, and now you will pay the Empire for the privilege of disappearing." As the man was escorted out, not by police but by the Kang's most discreet cleaners, Gino felt the final tether to his old life snap, leaving him standing in the center of the lobby with his three alphas. They didn't speak of the encounter, but that night, the bond was different. Less about the heat of the island and more about the heavy, permanent reality of a family built on choice rather than blood. Gino realized then that his silence wasn't a void he had been born with, but a fortress he had built to keep the world out, until he found three men brave enough to learn the language of his soul. The elimination of Gino's past served as the final catalyst for a total structural metamorphosis within the Kang Empire, transitioning the silent assistant into a formalized executive partner whose influence was now codified in the company's bylaws. As the Empire prepared for its first-ever triannual global summit, the pressure on the four of them reached a diamond-crushing intensity. The world was watching the Triple Kings and their silent sovereign, waiting for a single tremor of instability to exploit. Gino handled the logistics with a frightening, almost telepathic efficiency, coordinating a four-continent security net while simultaneously finalizing a merger that would give the Kangs a monopoly on clean energy tech in Southeast Asia. On the night before the summit, the brothers presented Gino with a gift that was less an ornament and more a statement of intent. A custom-tailored suit in deep obsidian silk, with a high collar designed specifically to frame, not hide, the three claiming marks that declared his status. When the summit began, Gino didn't sit in the back. He sat at a square table where all four sides were equal, his amber eyes scanning the room of 200 global CEOs with a gaze that made several men look away in instinctive submission. A representative from a Western conglomerate tried to dismiss Gino's lack of speech during a heated debate over mineral rights, only for Junho to stop mid-sentence, the room falling into a chilling silence as all three brothers turned their identical, ice-gray eyes on the offender. Gino didn't need their defense, however. He simply opened his laptop and projected a series of data visualizations that revealed he had already anticipated the conglomerate's hostile bid and had, within the last 20 minutes, bought out their primary logistics provider. He wrote a single, elegant sentence on his digital display for the entire hall to see. "Your voice is loud, but your leverage is non-existent. Please sit down." The roar of silence that followed was the loudest sound Gino had ever made, a declaration that he wasn't just a part of the Kang family. He was the brain that directed the muscle of the Empire. That night, as the four of them stood on the balcony of the summit hall looking out at the ocean, the brothers didn't treat him as a prize won, but as a territory gained. They realized that while they had claimed him on the island, he had effectively conquered them in return, turning their three separate lives into a single, unbreakable machine of which he was the primary operator. The summit's triumph had elevated them to a height where the air was thin, and the enemies were no longer corporate rivals, but political entities who feared the unchecked power of a four-headed dynasty. Within the sanctuary of their private life, a new, more delicate tension began to thrum, the realization that while they were invincible as a unit, the world's focus on Gino as the linchpin made him the target of a more sophisticated kind of psychological warfare. Anonymous threats began to arrive, not with demands for money or stock, but with dossiers detailing the precise seconds of Gino's daily routine, a chilling reminder that his silence was still being mistaken for a vulnerability that could be exploited to break the kings. The brothers' protective instincts flared into a near-pathological obsession, leading to a heated, silent confrontation in the war room when Junho suggested moving Gino to a fortified estate in the mountains, effectively exiling him from the empire he had helped build for the sake of his safety. Gino didn't reach for his notepad. He stood and walked to the center of the room, his hands moving in a flurry of sign language that was as sharp and punishing as a physical blow. "You are trying to save the ghost by burying him alive, but I didn't survive that island to live in a cellar," he signed, his amber eyes wet with a rare, furious grief that silenced the brothers' arguments instantly. He forced them to see that by hiding him, they were validating the enemy's premise, that he was a weakness to be managed rather than a partner to be wielded. To break the deadlock, Gino revealed his final move. He had spent weeks building a decentralized dead man's switch in the Empire's global network, a program that would release the financial secrets of every world leader to the public if any of the four of them were harmed. He was holding the world hostage to ensure their collective safety, a move so cold and so brilliant that it left even Youngwan breathless. He leaned his forehead against Junho, then Junsu's, then Yungwen's, the claiming marks on his neck glowing under the recessed lighting as he signed one final haunting truth. "We are not four people anymore. We are a single disaster, and I am the one holding the trigger." The brothers finally understood that the only way to protect Gino was to let him be as dangerous as he truly was, accepting that their Omega was the most lethal weapon in their arsenal. The final evolution of the Kang Empire was not marked by a grand battle, but by a chilling, absolute peace that settled over East Asia, born from the realization that the four-headed dragon was entirely untouchable. 3 years after the island, the ghost of the Kang Empire had become a mythic figure, an Omega who sat at the apex of a global hierarchy, whose silence was feared more than the most aggressive declarations of war. In the quiet sanctuary of their anniversary, a date they marked not by the day of the kidnapping, but by the day Gino chose to stay, the four of them retreated to the same South China Sea island, now transformed into a private, high-tech fortress of glass and white stone. Standing on the balcony where he had once been bound, Gino looked out at the water, his amber eyes reflecting the silver moonlight, no longer a captive of his silence but a master of it. The brothers joined him, their presence a physical weight of devotion. Junho stood to his right, the strategist, Junsu to his left, the protector, and Yungwen behind him, the heart, his chin resting on Gino's shoulder. Gino didn't need to write or sign to communicate the profound depth of his contentment. He simply leaned back into their warmth, his fingers tracing the permanent marks on his neck that had long since stopped being symbols of a struggle and had become the seal of his sovereignty. He had successfully inverted every trope of his nature, proving that an Omega who cannot speak can still command the wind, and that a man who moves in silence is not invisible, but inevitable. As the dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in the same amber hue as his eyes, Gino realized that his story wasn't a tragedy of what he lacked, but a masterpiece of what he had built from the quiet. He was the architect of their peace, the heartbeat of their empire, and the silent king who had taught 3 alphas that the greatest power in the world isn't the ability to roar, but the wisdom to listen. The empire ran smoother than ever, a machine of perfect synchronization, and as the four of them watched the sun rise, they knew that their bond was the only law that mattered in a world that had finally learned to fear the ghost who never truly left.